We're back for part 2 of our lecture on thermoregulation. This is Dr. Jenkins. Here we go. In the first part of the video for this chapter, we talked about ways in which our body takes in heat or generates heat, and then ways in which we can dissipate heat, the need to have that balance. We talked about how our body reacts to hot temperatures and to cold temperatures. So let's continue on here. We, of course, this is a science class, have to talk about regulation of this process, because it's very important that our body is able to make these decisions for us at the right times and to the right extent. Okay? All right. Just like anything else, when we talk about regulation, there are two body systems that function to regulate things. You probably are not surprised to hear me say the nervous system. We know the brain, we know all that. The brain helps to oversee the body. Well, what you may not think about, just as important, would be our endocrine system, which contains glands that release a bunch of hormones that act as very important chemical messengers. So when we're talking about pretty much anything, regulating the digestive system, regulating our body's response to exercise, regulating how we thermoregulate, it's always, always, always going to be a combination of the nervous system and endocrine system. So here we go. Now, we talked about the hypothalamus as it related to fluid balance. Well, guess what? Not only is this area in the brain called the hypothalamus an overseer for fluid balance in our body, it is also our body's quote-unquote thermostat. This is the main part of our nervous system that is overseeing our core temperature. So when we say this, our body's thermostat, it is helping, it's overseeing maintenance of our body's core temperature. Our body likes balance, right? It likes balance in our blood pH. It likes balance in the amount of blood sugar that we maintain in the circulation. We like balance in core temperature. And our hypothalamus, for quite a small area of the brain, boy, it does so much for us. You don't need to know the how. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. But the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that's going to be kind of overseeing our body's ability to maintain the proper core temperature, which very much includes activating means of heat dissipation when needed. We also rely on the endocrine system, and it might seem a little unrelated to you at this point, but without me getting into too much detail, our ability to maintain our body's core temperature is very much associated with fluid balance. So we have to maintain both. Because as I said, when it's hot, our body will sweat more. And when you sweat more, you lose more fluid. So we can see that our response to temperature and thermoregulation is almost always tied or associated with fluid. So for that reason, when it comes to our endocrine system, we're going to be relying very much on ADH, which we talked about before in our fluid balance chapter. So ADH is released from our brain, the pituitary gland, but don't worry about that. ADH is a hormone that goes to the kidneys and tells them to retain more water. I also want to introduce a second hormone, and that is aldosterone. So if ADH tells our kidneys to retain more water, so a really easy way to define ADH is our water retaining hormone. It goes to our kidney, tells our kidneys to retain more water, which means that we're peeing out less. Well, if we're going to define ADH as our water-retaining hormone, we're going to consider aldosterone our salt-retaining hormone. I know it says water up here, but that's only because water follows salt. The direct action of aldosterone is to tell the kidneys to retain more salt. Okay. Excellent. Now, when we talk about thermoregulation, we're also including other body systems to help carry it out. So in terms of pure regulation, we would consider the nervous system and endocrine system to be our regulators. What systems are activated? So maybe regulation isn't the best way to title this slide. These are the systems that are involved in maintaining. How about I can't? This has happened before, hasn't it? When I'm talking and I can't seem to spell at the same time. Involved in maintaining body temperature. So it's like these systems get direction from the nervous system and endocrine system, but these are the systems that actually carry out our ability to thermoregulate. So we have to be able to alter blood flow. So a big part of maintaining a big part of maintaining core body temperature is being able to send blood flow to different parts of the body when it's needed. Because what do? When we want to sweat, we've got to send more blood flow to the surface of the skin. So the cardiovascular system is absolutely involved, okay? And then, of course, we have to use the integumentary system, which is the body system that includes the skin. So these are body systems also involved in thermoregulation. All right, I gave you a similar schematic here before for fluid balance. Well, thermoregulation is also a negative feedback mechanism. You don't have to know all these details. Just review the things that we talked about. So I talked about the hypothalamus being a major brain control center. Talked about hormones. So make sure you review ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and aldosterone. This is how we get the cardiovascular system and the integumentary systems involved. Some people are visual, so this is a nice way to see what happens, right? And how you would read this is what's happening first. Someone's exercising, which leads to this, and then this, and you go all the way around, right? Okay. I mentioned this in the first video, so let's just make sure that we talk about it. Acclimatization. Now, our body can physiologically adapt to different conditions. And we're going to talk about temperature and humidity. You can, of course, also acclimatize to altitude. When we talk about these processes, the ability of the body to adapt, and when I mean adapt, make significant physiological adaptations. So it's not just that you quote unquote feel better, but you make significant physiological adaptations. And this can indeed happen over time. When you spend time exercising in the heat and humidity, your body will make significant physiological adaptations, making you better able to handle it. Okay. How does our body acclimatize to heat? As I said, you really can't acclimatize to cold so much. But when we're in the heat for an extended period of time, so this can't happen over the course of a day, a couple hours. It's got to be an extended period of time. And we'll talk about how long in a minute. When you expose yourself to heat and/or humidity. I'm talking about both. When you expose your body to heat and/or humidity for an extended period of time, these are the physiological adaptations. You will start to sweat earlier, and that is a good thing. When you become better trained, when you become more acclimated to heat and humidity, you will sweat earlier. And what that means is your body's starting the process sooner, which means it can get rid of more heat, dissipate more heat to help to keep your body cooler. Not only will you start sweating sooner, you will sweat more because your sweat glands are more active. When it's hot out, you want to sweat more. That just means you're being able to release more heat. Now, I mentioned this in the fluid balance chapter. I'm going to say it again. Something like sweat rate is extremely variable. So it's hard to compare between people because we're all different genetically. I will tell you, I'm a pretty disgusting sweater. So even before I'm acclimatized to heat and humidity, I tend to be a big sweater. But I do sweat even more when I'm acclimatized. Some people don't sweat as much naturally. But for whoever you're looking at, going from non-acclimated or non-acclimatized to acclimated, you will sweat more. You'll sweat sooner. Those are the physiological adaptations. Really cool. Okay, there are some factors to consider. I mentioned age, I think, in our fluid balance chapter. Let me just say it again. Age. Children cannot thermoregulate as well. Children produce less sweat. They tend to have a higher core temperature to begin with, and they take longer to acclimatize. So like I said before, if you're a big bad coach of a Pop Warner football team, you want to make a move, and it's really hot out, you have to remember the physiological truths. Children don't have as much surface area, and they're not able to sweat as much. So they cannot handle the heat as well as an adult. Gender. If you were to compare men and women, on one hand, males produce more sweat and have more body surface area. Let me just check ahead here. Okay. On one hand, males they produce more sweat, but I'm going to tell you something. Females are more efficient sweaters. So what that means is women don't have to sweat as much volume of sweat to get the same amount of evaporation. For whatever, I'm a woman, right? Identify as a woman. I am a biological woman. Female, however you want to say it. For the volume of sweat that I produce, I'm able to evaporate a large percentage of it. Men produce more sweat, and they tend to be more wasteful sweaters. They're not quite as efficient. So we could argue in many ways the genders can acclimate to heat very similarly. Some studies you read will say, even though this is the case, men are a little bit better able to overall thermoregulate. I don't think that we have enough data to really say for sure, but that's reasonable. But the idea that there's a big difference between men and women in their ability to thermoregulate and acclimate, our current research is showing that that's not true. So for the most part, the genders are pretty equal. It may be true that in some ways men are a little bit better able to thermoregulate, but there's not a big difference. What if we compare someone with a lot of body fat to someone with low body fat? And I'm just going to compare big dude, like this lineman, to skinny dude. Big dude has more body fat, and body fat, remember, acts as an insulator. It keeps in heat. Not only that, but the thickness of that body fat under the skin means that the water from the blood has to travel a greater distance to get to the skin to be able to evaporate. So a big dude is less able to acclimate and thermoregulate. So even though you may not necessarily think about it, a big dude is oftentimes more at risk for heat illness because his body has to work harder to get rid of heat. And because of the layer of body fat that's thicker, he's probably generating and keeping more heat anyway. Okay, so what are the recommendations? Well, if you want to get the acclimatization, if you want to get those significant physiological adaptations, it takes time. Okay? How long? Well, this is a wide debate in the field of exercise physiology. Obviously, the more time, the better. What I will tell you is maybe within 2 to 3 days of exercising in a hot or humid environment, you will begin to acclimate. The ideal would be 10 to 14 days plus to get the most most acclimatization. Okay, so 2 to 3 days, we think we can begin to see some of these acclimatization physiological adaptations, but 10 to 14 days plus is always ideal, but sometimes it's just not possible. All right, heat illness. We talked about this before. Julie Moss up top. I think it was 1983, Hawaii Ironman. And then Corey Stringer, lineman for the Minnesota Vikings that died in training camp from heat illness. Make sure you review all of these. It affects everyone, but if you're less trained, it's going to affect you more. So one of the strategies is to show up to training camp in shape. Once you get to a higher level, some people say, well, training camp is my opportunity to get into shape. If you view it that way, you're going to be in trouble. You absolutely need to show up to training camp with at least some level of fitness, right? Okay, heat cramps. I think we've all probably experienced this or know someone who has. It feels like, involuntary muscle spasms. It's oftentimes our diaphragm that's spasming involuntarily. To be honest with you, despite how common they are, we don't know a lot about them. We think that they're linked to dehydration and or electrolyte imbalances, but when you do scientific studies where one group is dehydrated to a small degree on purpose or has an electrolyte imbalance on purpose, they don't overall have a greater risk of muscle cramps than those who were fully hydrated. Some people seem to be more prone to them. We're thinking now it might have more to do with the nerve endings coming into and out of the muscle. But these are just uncomfortable. It's not a serious medical condition, just more of a uncomfortable situation. But it, of course, can influence your performance. The next up in severity is heat exhaustion. And the worst, of course, is heat stroke. Heat exhaustion is just when your body begins to overheat, where your ability to dissipate heat or get rid of heat is overwhelmed by the amount of heat you're generating. So you're generating more heat than you can get rid of. So basically it says this: ineffective thermoregulation. So your body is trying to get rid of this excess heat, but it's starting to not be able to keep up. It could just be poor hydration. It could just be an environment that you're not used to, and if you're not acclimated to it, it's going to take a toll on your body. You can read through some of the symptoms. I want to point out that you're still sweating. That's why you have red skin. You might feel nauseous or be weak. If this is starting to happen to you, you have to take action. Obviously, the best treatment is prevention. But if you're starting to feel this way, you need to slow down or stop. Because if you continue to stay in that environment and continue to stress your body in the same way, it will lead you to heat stroke. This is very serious. This is when you will stop sweating. I mentioned this in last lecture. If you realize, and usually, it happens over time, so you'll begin to sweat and you think, oh, my body's doing what it should be. But if you notice that your skin is starting to become cool to the touch or clammy or pale and you stop sweating, you're getting closer to this heat stroke. This is a medical emergency. If you ever come across this, do not give them fluids immediately. All right. I want to touch upon not only heat illness, but also what can go along with that, and that would be electrolyte imbalances. We talked about electrolytes. We already know what they are. Charged particles that carry a current. We know that they're important because we need them to generate a muscle contraction or nerve impulse. We know that our primary ones are potassium and sodium. We know that sodium is found in higher amounts outside of cells, and potassium is found in higher amounts inside of cells. Whew. The two most common imbalances would be hyponatremia and hyperkalemia. I'd like you to know those two. Here's how I remembered the terms. Hyponatremia has Na, which is the symbol for sodium or salt, right in it. So hyponatremia, remember, because it has Na, which is the sodium for salt. Whereas hypokalemia has a symbol for potassium. And then hyper means more than, and hypo means less than. So if you break down the word, hyponatremia is a condition where the sodium in your blood is too low. Hyperkalemia is a condition where the potassium in your blood is too high. Let's first talk about hyponatremia, a condition of too little salt. You don't have to know the exact numbers. I mentioned this already, so how could it happen? It could happen when I'll just write it down, don't bring in enough salt. So if you're sweating and you sweat salt out as well as the water, but you don't replenish it, you could be at risk for being hyponatremic. So if you're running a marathon only drinking in water, that's not going to cut it, okay? Because you're not replenishing the sodium that you're losing in addition to the water that you're losing. Or it could also happen from excessive water. I mentioned this in our last chapter. So sometimes if you just bring in too much water, you're going to dilute the amount of sodium in the blood, making your relative sodium concentration go down. You can read about the predisposing risk factors. I'm not going to ask you about those. I mentioned this before. Some people tend to be saltier sweaters than others, so pay attention. If you're on a certain medication, it's a diuretic, a low sodium diet, these could be predisposing factors. The signs and symptoms are going to be similar to that for dehydration, or heat illness for that matter. So don't worry about the signs and symptoms, because you can just say, well, the signs and symptoms of hyponatremia would be very similar to those for heat illness. I mentioned before my experience of being dehydrated and having a bit of hyponatremia. Yeah. So here they did my blood sodium after this marathon, 138. So it's pretty much within normal. Some people say 140 is normal, so you could say it was slightly hyponatremic. But I was definitely hyperkalemic because it was 7.8. Let's talk about hyperkalemic in a minute. What's the treatment for hyponatremia? Take them out of the environment, give them sodium. The prevention would be pretty self-explanatory here. Keep your hydration, pay attention to whether you're a salty sweater or not, so you know how much salt you need to bring in. Some people need to actually bring in salt tablets, even though I am a pretty salty sweater, just through trial and error, when I drink my Accelerate and my Ritz peanut butter crackers, that is enough salt to replenish what I'm losing. I know because I feel okay. Some people, that may not be enough, and they may have to take some salt tablets that you can buy as little sport supplements. Oh, see, look, that's the end of the slide, but I do want to go back to hyperkalemia. I did ask you to know it. Okay. Hyperkalemia is just a condition where we have too much potassium. The normal is about 3 to 5. You don't have to know that number, but when I say the normal is 3 to 5 and my potassium was 7.8, that's really high. These tend to happen hand in hand. Okay, so when one is high, the other is usually low. One thing I want to mention, but it won't be on the test, hyperkalemia, one thing that could lead to is heart problems. This won't be on the test, but I'm just saying it. Specifically, arrhythmias, where your heart rate will start to shoot up to like 200, 210 beats per minute because that excess potassium is messing with the electrical conduction of your heart. So a real serious case of hyperkalemia could actually lead to serious heart problems. Won't be on the test, just wanted to say it. All right, folks, another chapter in the books. Well done.